Hi, I'm Ewan Jones. I'm the Environment Officer at St George's Church. This is a recorded version of the climate change training that we ran in October and November 2020. We've split the video into two parts. The first part, which this is about what climate change is and what its effects are. And the second part deals with ways that we can respond to that by reducing our emissions and by praying and campaigning for others to do the same.
Hi, I'm Izzy. I'm married to Ewan, but that's not how I got interested in climate change. I've had an interest in climate change for a long time. In fact, I found this in an old school book from 1996 when I was in year 7. And the basic science of climate change was already well established by this point in the 1990s. Research started in the 1950s, and the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was set up in 1988. But despite my impassioned argument of how we needed to stop global warming, as we often still called it in the 1990s, it didn't seem like an emergency to the 11-year-old me. It seemed like something that would impact far-off places in the far-off future. But now I find myself in 2020, an auntie to 7 lovely nieces and nephews, and with nearly 25 years more of the planet warming behind me. And the phrase climate emergency is now in common use. And I begin to realise that this is the generation that's going to feel the effects of climate change. And the effects are, in fact, already being felt around the world. And the extent to which we can manage to tackle climate change is going to have a massive effect on their futures, on the extent to which they will live in a world, a United Kingdom, which is peaceful, stable, ruled by law and order, and which has a functioning economy, or the opposite. But what is climate change? Well, here's a better diagram than the one I drew in 1996. So the Earth naturally has gases, which we call greenhouse gases, which help to keep some of the heat of the sun within the Earth's atmosphere. So they fulfill an important function of helping to keep the Earth warm, just like a greenhouse. However, as a result of human activities, we're now releasing vast amounts of additional greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which is affecting the delicate balance of these greenhouse gases, resulting in the Earth slowly warming as the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are building up. The key greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, methane, and also nitrous oxide and some other gases. But carbon dioxide is the big one. And that's because we've been releasing so much of it since the Industrial Revolution by burning fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. This graph is from an American government department website, and it's of carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere over the last 800,000 years. And you can see how they've shot up in modern times. But so what? My geography teacher in 1996 used to ask us to ask this question. So what? So you've noticed something in the world, why should we care about it? The result of this is that the global average temperature has risen by 1 degree since the Industrial Revolution. And the planet is going to continue to warm into the future. The amount of future warming depends on how urgently we can act. But again, so what? 1 degree, it doesn't sound very significant. I'm going to hand over to David Kibble, who's going to explain a bit more about the effects of climate change.
My normal fields of interest are Christian theology, interfaith relations, the Middle East, and peacemaking. So why am I talking to you about climate change? In 2019, we saw a lot of media coverage given to Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg. I thought I ought to have a look at the whole issue. Now, at the end of 2019, I had a holiday booked in California, and so I decided to take something to read on the topic. But what should I read? Well, I looked on Amazon, and this is the one I found. Climate Change by Joseph Romm. I thought that would be a good book. It's published by Oxford University Press, so it's reliable and not sensational. And the guy who wrote it seemed to know his stuff. So I started reading it on the plane. And then I read a bit more in San Francisco. And finally, I finished it in San Diego. By the end of my time in San Diego, I was horrified. I had no idea that we were in such a dire situation. I said to my wife, why don't we all understand how serious this problem is? I certainly didn't realize, and I don't think a lot of other people did either. On my return home, I read a number of other books. Now, the way I learn is either by teaching or by writing. So I decided to write an article for a Royal Naval journal on how climate change might affect the Royal Navy. I have a bit of a naval background. So I did some research in Leeds University Library, and in February, my article was published. What I'm going to do now is to use some of my research to give you an idea of what the effects of climate change will be. But it's not just what the effects will be, it's what the effects are already. At the start of 2020, the news covered the bushfires in Australia. The fires resulted in 33 people being killed, 3,000 homes destroyed or damaged, and 21% of Australians' bush destroyed. Now, climate scientists say that there are always bushfires in the Australian summer, but those in 2020 were particularly bad. The main causes were drought, one of the worst in Australia's history, and a heat wave of 40 degrees plus, and strong winds. And then later on in 2020, in the autumn, we saw something similar in the west of the USA. The figures at the moment that I have are 40 dead and 4.5 million acres burnt. That's the area the size of Wales. You see there the Golden Gate Bridge, which I showed you a picture of, my wife and I standing in front of in our holiday. One young boy in San Francisco, he was going to school one day when the weather was like that. It was caused because the smoke from the fires in the forests caused a big pall of smoke over San Francisco. And he said to his dad, "Daddy, why are we going to school in the middle of the night?" At the end of 2020, the BBC then highlighted forest fires in Siberia. As well as the forest fires, we know that the permafrost is melting and that releases methane. Over a 20-year period, methane is 82 times more powerful a greenhouse gas than CO2. So can we say that these changes I've been talking about are caused by climate change? Well, after initial caution, scientists are now talking about these increases being the result of climate change. For example, they've analysed what happened in Siberia, and they suggest that climate change made the fires in Siberia more likely by a factor of 600 times. Now, most people probably know about Australia and California and maybe Siberia, but I wonder whether you know about the effects that flooding had in Africa in 2019. Just look at these figures. Again, scientists are now talking about the increase in flooding being the result of climate change. So what then will be the major effects of climate change? There they are: a rise in sea level, a rise in temperature, food insecurity, impacts on health, extreme weather events, and social and political consequences. I'll say a little bit about some of these effects. First of all, a rise in sea level. Different studies use different models to offer predictions. The International Panel on Climate Change suggested that by 2100, there would be a rise in sea level between 20 and 39 inches. However, other studies, which build on a better factoring of melting ice sheets at the poles, suggest that actually that rise might be between 36 and 60 inches. At the end of 2019, a report was published on the rate of melting ice in Greenland. It concluded that the ice is now melting 7 times faster than it was in 1990, and that its melt alone could result in a global sea rise of 2.5 inches by the end of the century. Professor Andy Shepherd of Leeds University said on the day the report was published, "The simple formula is that around the planet, 6 million people are brought into a flooding situation for every centimetre of sea level rise." Now here's a projection of what might be happening in China. There's a map there of Shanghai and Hangzhou. On the left is a picture of what it might look like in 2100 under what is known as the business as usual scenario. In other words, we don't do much about climate change, we carry on as normal. And you can see there that by 2100, the sea level has risen significantly around the 2 cities. If you look at the map on the right, that shows you what will happen by 2100, again under the business as usual scenario, but this time there's annual coastal flooding as well. So that's what will happen around Shanghai and Hangzhou in China in 2100 if we just carry on as we are. And here's what might happen in Britain. Again, the first map here shows you what will happen by 2100 if we carry on as normal. Areas around the Wash, South Yorkshire and the Humber, and between Blackpool and Liverpool and around the Somerset coast, all flooded permanently. But we have to add to that annual flooding, and now we see this huge amount of flooding around the Wash, South Yorkshire, Blackpool, Liverpool, and North Somerset. And here's what Miami might look like under the same conditions. If we do nothing, this is what might happen. Other cities at risk include Cairo and Jakarta. Second, a rise in global temperatures. Some of you may have seen a BBC report of work being done at Edinburgh and Oxford universities, that summer temperatures in Scotland, 30 degrees centigrade, will become quite common. Now, to some of us, that might sound quite good, but it has negative impacts. There'll be an increase in pests, jellyfish, mosquitoes and wasps, and there'll be a lower yield of peas, broccoli, cauliflower, whiskey distilleries will be closed for parts of the summer because the streams will dry up. But the effects are going to be much more severe elsewhere. You've seen the bushfires in Australia and Western USA. The International Panel on Climate Change says that in the not too distant future, working out of doors is going to be unhealthy in some areas of the globe. Even if we meet the Paris goals, annual heat waves in Karachi and Kolkata will be deadly. In 2015, thousands were killed by heat waves in India and Pakistan. In a 2016 heat wave in Iraq, the temperature was over 37 degrees in May, 43 in June, and 49 in July. Where such conditions exist, people cannot work properly, an individual's income goes down. Where their income goes down, the country suffers as well economically. 20 years ago, workers in El Salvador were able to work comfortably in the sugarcane fields. Now, 1/5 of the male population there suffers from chronic kidney disease because of dehydration caused by working in the fields. By 2050, over 250,000 are expected to die globally from the direct effects of heat. Food insecurity. I've mentioned problems with peas, broccoli and cauliflower in Scotland, But of course, things will be much worse elsewhere. Temperature rise, a rise in water levels and flooding will all affect food production. One calculation that's been made concludes that for every half a degree of warming, cereal crop yields will drop by 10%. The 2019 report from the Science Advisory Group says that after improvements in feeding the world's population, that improvement is now being reversed. In 2015, there were 785 million undernourished. But in 2018, that figure had gone up to 821 million. It had been going down, but now because of climate change, it's gone up. Impacts on health. Temperature rise is a key factor in the spread of infectious disease. The higher the temperature, the greater the spread of infectious disease. With climate change, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand and most of Southeast Asia will all be at risk of increased dengue fever transmission and increased respiratory illnesses. Insect-borne diseases such as malaria, Zika and Lyme disease will all increase in line with temperature rise. But there are secondary consequences of climate change too, some of which we're seeing already. Migration. People migrate for a number of reasons, often complex and intertwined. But there's no doubt that climate change is becoming a big factor. No one knows how many will need to migrate in the future, but a report from the World Bank suggests there could be up to 140 million migrating as a result of climate change. Second secondary consequence, conflict. Climate change is one of the factors that lead to conflict in difficult and unstable areas of the world, and it often combines with religious differences and social problems. Let's look at northern Nigeria for a moment. There you have a group of northern Nigerian Christians demonstrating against what they say is the killings by the Fulani herdsmen. Now, the Fulani herdsmen have traditionally herded in the southern part of the Sahara. But because of climate change, the Sahara is growing bigger because of desertification. So they're having to move south. And they're moving south into the area occupied by these northern Nigerians. And so there's armed conflict. So you can see it as a religious conflict, Muslims versus Christians. But you can also see it as the result of climate change. They're intertwined. Conclusion. As a Christian, I believe that faith communities who believe that we're stewards of God's creation are in a unique position to influence how people respond to climate change. I believe that we can and should lead and model responses to the current threat. Pope Francis has said that we all need an ecological conversion. We need to call for that conversion first within the church and then outside it. And we should start with our own congregations.
Thank you, David. And as part of this training, we wanted to explore some of the human stories behind the facts and figures. So we decided to interview a few people from St. George's who are from different countries around the world. So here's Raquels' story.
Hello, hi, my name is Raquel and I'm from South Sudan. So I'm just going to talk about the climate change in South Sudan. I remember last year when I was there, there's no rain, 3 days no water. So we had to wait for the army to help us with the water, and I had to travel. It's a long distance to get the water.
And how did you travel?
I had to walk. It's a long distance walking because people had to pay for the water.
Yeah.
And then after some months, the rain came. It was just pouring. So the rain came when it was dry season. So it rained for some days and then end up flooding. Of course, when the rain comes, the houses, in the compound, a lot of water. And of course, there's not enough food after that, and people suffer a lot because of that. And of course, when there's water, mosquitoes a lot, and of course, malaria.
Right.
Yeah.
So the flood water damaged the food that was stored or grown? Growing.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
So here's some photos that Raquel kindly shared with me as well. One of Raquel carrying the water, and Raquel with her mum, who sounds like an amazing lady of faith who just keeps trusting in God through many difficulties that she's lived through in her life. And this is a BBC article about the floods that Raquel mentioned in 2019. And mentioning that 400,000 people lost their homes in South Sudan in those floods. And here's Moses' story.
Hi, my name is Moses Dahal. I'm from Nepal. Today, I am here to talk about the climate change impact in Nepal. In Nepal, there is 15% landmass is Himalayas, that is snow-covered mountains, and it starts from Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Tibet, Nepal, Bhutan, and goes down to Myanmar. This range is a gift from God to sustain the life and the biodiversity in and around this range. This range is also a sustainable sanctuary for many wildlife, migration birds, and for human civilization from the beginning. It is also known as a third pole because of the Mount Everest. Many wildlife are in danger here now, just because of the change in weather patterns. Snow is melting. It has caused the desertification in the Himalayan range. There is a huge soil erosion. Many lives are under great risk of glacier lake bursting, and people are facing nowadays those who live nearby. There is also a change in the monsoon patterns in Nepal. A huge flooding, massive landslides and droughts people are facing. There is also a huge wildfire and emerging new diseases people are facing in Nepal. That is dengue. So in Nepal, these people are facing climate change impact that is caused in this earth. So this is a time to act responsibly for the protection of this beautiful God's creation.
So how about these guys? What is their stories going to be? These pictures were taken in 2020. So by 2100, the youngest of them, the two twins, will be 80. This graph shows a series of different greenhouse gas emissions scenarios up until 2100. And it makes predictions for the overall warming we can expect, depending on what's been done to curb greenhouse gas emissions. As I mentioned before, we're already at 1 degree of warming, which is already having global impacts. In 2015, the 196 states which make up the UN forged the Paris Climate Agreement, agreeing to take action to keep global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. Now, the green line at the bottom of this graph shows what is needed to avoid 1.5 degrees of warming. You'll see it requires us to reach net zero emissions by mid-century, and after that to start removing some of the greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. Quite a challenge. The blue lines in the middle of the graph show that unfortunately neither the actual policies in place in countries around the world or the pledges and targets made by each country in climate summits, including Paris, are actually on track to keep warming to below 2 degrees. And are actually, according to climate action trackers, information heading more for 2.5 to 3 degrees. The top area in the grey is the baseline business as usual projection. So if countries fail to implement policies or pull out altogether, like the US did, although is now rejoining the Paris Agreement, or even if countries stop increasing their efforts into the future, we could be looking at somewhere between 4 and 4.8 degrees of warming. But even then, so what? 4 degrees, it doesn't sound like very much. Well, firstly, if we get to 4 degrees, that's actually a massive shift in the global climate. Humans have never lived in a world at that temperature. The last time the world was this hot was 15 million years ago, during the Miocene period. I've heard climate scientists describe a 4-degree world as like living on a different planet, and it certainly will be the Earth as human beings have never known it before. This is one example of the kind of predictions that scientists make about a world where carbon emissions have been allowed to carry on increasing unchecked. This is a figure from a research paper published by various authors, including Tim Lenton from the University of Exeter on the picture. And one important thing to understand to make sense of this research is that the land warms more rapidly than the sea. So, for example, if the world warms by 4 degrees on average, the warming over the land masses is going to be much higher than that. And what I wanted to point out is the black areas and the hashed areas on the map. The black areas are areas of the world that currently have an average annual temperature of over 29 degrees centigrade. You'll notice they're relatively small areas, largely in the Sahara Desert, which don't support a large population. The hashed areas represents the areas of the world that are likely to have the same average annual temperature over 29 degrees by 2070, based on a high emission scenario. The hashed areas represent 19% of the Earth's landmass, including some highly populated areas like much of India. And the authors expect that 3.5 billion people would be living in that area in 2070. That is not taking into account migration. And of course, mass migration would be one of the key predictions of this scenario, because these areas would be becoming increasingly uninhabitable for those who can't afford expensive adaptation measures in this scenario. And I just want to acknowledge here that this is quite distressing information, especially if you're looking at that map and thinking, yeah, my family lives there, people I know and love live in those areas. And so we all need to take time to acknowledge our emotions and talk to each other and support each other in these times. But I would also say that this is a high emission scenario. So my interpretation is we can still prevent this. It's important to note that over the long term, the effects of climate change are not linear, are not expected to be linear. So the impact of a 2-degree rise is expected to be more than double the impact of a 1-degree rise, and 4 degrees, again, more than double the impact of 2 degrees. This is because of feedback loops and tipping points. There are many different feedback loops. Just as a couple of examples, so ice and snow are white, obviously, so they reflect heat from the Earth. And so as more ice and snow melts with the planet warming, so the planet also absorbs more heat from the sun and accelerates the warming. Also, as David mentioned, there is a problem with the permafrost melting because the permafrost contains high levels of methane and carbon dioxide. As it melts, it will release that carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, again, contributing to further warming. And there are also expected to be tipping points, which is where a threshold is reached beyond which a chain of events is kicked off, resulting in a disproportionate impact, just like a domino effect. So, for example, there are expected to be thresholds beyond which the Earth's major ice sheets are tipped into an irreversible course of melting. So as a result of feedback loops and tipping points, all the effects we've talked about, flooding, drought, disease, sea level rise, and so on, are expected to accelerate with every little bit of warming. And also, unfortunately, as we don't know exactly where most of the tipping points are, the further we get into warming, the more risk there is of setting these tipping points off. Or the other way to see it, to put a slightly more positive spin on it, is that every little bit of warming we can prevent has a disproportionate benefit. back to this lot again. So what will the world look like when they're 80, or the youngest of them are 80 in 2100? Well, we don't know exactly, but we do know what the key risks and challenges are going to be. What we don't know is the exact scale of the impacts. And partly because it depends on the extent to which the world can act to curb greenhouse gas emissions. So for me, if there's a risk that the world will look anything like approaching the map on the previous slide within their lifetimes, or even their children or grandchildren's lifetimes, I know I want to try to do what I can to prevent that. So this is where we had a time of small group discussion with these small group questions. So it's worth having a think about these yourself, maybe talk to friends and family about them, share them in your small group if you didn't attend the training. So now we know what the challenge is and what we need to work urgently to prevent. I would strongly encourage you to watch the second part of the video, which is Ewan's presentation on what we can do about global greenhouse gas emissions in our own lives and through campaigning and prayer. Thank you.